Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Well-Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. We'll also talk a little bit about the various methods and devices of execution that have been deployed throughout time. I'm your host, Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. This is the second of 3 episodes that we're calling Killing the Cowards, and it pertains to capital punishment of its own soldiers that took place among the feuding armies during the First World War. Almost all of these would have been for cowardice, desertion, and sometimes for sedition. So come join us as we take a peek into this little-known and rarely discussed topic, and if you like it and find it interesting, join us on our other episodes, number 1 that deal with the American Civil War, and number 3 that deal with World War II. But for today, our time machine has just touched down on the battlefields of France, but also neighboring countries during World War I. As far east as Russia. And that all told claimed the lives of roughly 10 million soldiers. It also claimed probably the same number of civilians in a roughly 4-year period. So let that one sit in. 10 million young men killed, and 10 million others of all stripes killed, due to the insanity that didn't make a lot of sense then and makes less sense now. And there can never be enough books, films, podcasts, etc., to cover the scope of the human carnage of the First World War. But as to our mission, we will focus on the plight of those that died at the hands of their fellow countrymen for desertion, sometimes sedition or spying, during this tragic and barbaric event in human history. Admittedly, the exact numbers are difficult, if not impossible, to ascertain, but we'll do our best to understand and explain them. Part of this imperfect inquiry has to do with some basic nomenclature. What is or was a coward? Is a coward the same as a deserter? Is a so-called prisoner of conscience any more or less virtuous than a guy with a gun in his hand that runs away after seeing his trenchmates shot or gassed? Is sedition tantamount to desertion? Well, that's what we'll be talking about. How about a shell-shocked teenager uprooted from his humble life, only to go literally insane after watching the slaughter of thousands of his peers within days, sometimes hours, of his deployment to a foreign soil? It would be silly, I think, and frankly disrespectful for a podcast like ours to weigh in on right or wrong or guilt or innocence. But what we can do is present the evidence as we can best understand it and interpret it. So after a short break, let's do our best to learn about this mostly unspoken topic and how it played out on the bloody battlefields of Europe from 1914 to 1918. Let's try to distill the prevalence of the practice into 2 main parts, just as we did in the Civil War, and we'll do next in World War II. And we'll try to talk about the 2 warring sides. In this case, of course, we have factions of nations, not just one or the other, pitted against the other side. And the first of these that we're going to talk about are the Allied powers, or the Entente. And the primary members, at least relative to our topic, would be France, the United Kingdom and its wider empire, Russia to a certain degree, that gets a little tricky, Italy, and eventually the United States. Many others, of course, were aligned with this side as well. And in the other corner, we have the Central Powers, those being Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and smaller states such as Bulgaria and several others. In total, of the tens of millions that had enlisted or were conscripted, officially about 4,000 would ultimately meet their end on the gallows or by firing squad from their own sides. Now we know this number is ridiculously understated, as most executions for this sort of thing were carried out summarily and without any formal documentation. Many were no doubt conducted in relative secrecy. So let's work with the official numbers that we do have and tell some of the stories of the more notable executions carried out during the war on both sides. Teaser alert. As we go quickly country by country, I'm guessing it might surprise you, as it did me, as to who was most keen on its use and who was most reluctant to utilize this form of retribution on its own troops. This will be a surprise. We have to begin with the Allies, and in particular in France, which of course was ground zero to much of the actual fighting and arguably took the largest hit in terms of the human toll and the irreparable damage to its home front. It suffered almost 6 million military casualties and 1.4 million killed in action. Now we have to let that one sit in for a minute, and maybe you'll reconsider the jokes and criticisms often cast their way regarding their less than noble role in the war that follows next, but that's your call. Question out there, how many French soldiers were sentenced to death for cowardice during the First World War? Well, the answer is around 2,500 or so, of whom 600 to 1,000, I think the closest number is somewhere in between that. I think it's probably about, the records question this. From what I've been reading, I think it's about 800 to 900 French soldiers were executed by their own countrymen. Again, these numbers pale in comparison to the wider picture, but they are nevertheless considerable and I think germane to our discussion. So who were these so-called cowards, and were they cowards? And why were they killed? And were their executions justified? We know some of their names, but most will be forever lost to an inglorious and disgraced fate. Let's try and picture the hellscape that was France and Belgium at this time. Utter terror, utter chaos, utter fear. Men and boys, uprooted from mostly unremarkable lives and heaved into a conflict that must have seemed totally anarchic and absurd. Monarchs, dictators, politicians, down to generals and their subordinates, all shouting orders to the proletariat to give their lives for a lost cause that they probably didn't agree with or even understand. Does anyone, even today, really understand? We know that many of these men or boys were shot as an example during the early stages of the war. The first were executed by their own comrades during the First War of the Marne, and that's in 1914. It's at the outset of the war. This came on the heels of the so-called Rape of Belgium, in which German soldiers overwhelmed that country, or quasi-country, sorry Belgian friends out there, on their advance to France. We'll focus on two notorious episodes on the French side, one in 1915 and the other in 1917. The first is particularly memorable and highly unusual, and it is known as the Souain affair. It's most notable because it involved the execution not of common soldiers, but 4 non-commissioned colonels. On the Western Front near Champagne in late winter, early spring of 1915, the French and German armies had been locked in a virtual stalemate for months, but despite this, many thousands of men had been killed for no obvious gain. The French general Relentless grew increasingly impatient, and he ordered several all-out assaults to reclaim positions taken by the Germans, and each of these failed, and they failed miserably. In fact, there were very serious logistical errors made, and there were all sorts of friendly fire deaths, and the trenches were so battered that, quote, going over the top with a bayonet against the Hun machine guns meant almost certain death. And so after further slaughter, the soldiers mutinied, as did some of the corporals, and they refused to fight. Relentless was so incensed at this perceived disloyalty that he actually ordered his own artillery to bomb his own positions as to force them out of the trenches and proceed toward the enemy. But a Colonel Raoul Berube refused to obey this command without written order, as the general had not provided one. So now the very apoplectic Relentless He's even more pissed off. So what does he do? He commands another colonel to gather arbitrarily the names of 18 enlisted soldiers. And catch this. This list was to be comprised of 2 of the youngest from each squad. And he also rounded up 6 colonels to be court-martialed. Well, the court-martial does take place, but eventually the 18 young plukes were given a stay because of the insanely arbitrary nature of their accusal, as were 2 of these 6 colonels who pled successfully that they never received word of the orders. But 4 of the colonels were soon to be shot to death, and that happened the next day by firing squad. And this event goes down as one of the most controversial events of the French side during the war, and it was commemorated in the famous book Paths of Glory by Humphrey Cobb in 1935, which was later adapted into an early film of the same name by Stanley Kubrick in 1957. Another major episode we'll discuss is what is known in English as the 1917 French Army mutinies. And this involved many more death sentences and many more executions. It takes place during the Second Battle of the Aisne, hope I have that right, in April 1917, which was promised by the general, Nivelle, as to be a great, perhaps war-ending victory, but it very quickly became a total failure. And this seemed to have had a very demoralizing effect on the soldiers who had lost over 1 million killed and millions other wounded to this point, and many of them had fought for sure at Verdun and the Somme, and morale was at its lowest point. And on top of this, they were promised American reinforcements that were supposed to have arrived but had not yet done so, and so a general mutiny broke out there, and they simply refused to fight what looked like a futile mission. Let's keep in mind here that most of these guys were probably hardened soldiers that had been through many battles, and they did not abscond. They knew the rules. They just simply refused to leave the trenches and commit suicide, which is really what it was going to be. Nivelle was replaced by the notorious General Pétain. I call him Putain. He was a really bad guy, and he quickly ordered mass arrests and mass trials. Later research found that an alarming, listen to this one, 3,427 court-martials were issued by Pétain, 2,878 to hard labor, and 629 to death. Wow. But as we're about to see with the English that follow, the French ultimately only carried out 49, that's still a lot, for this notorious mutiny. Let's take a break here and get a look at the ancient enemies of the French, but now the very fast friends of them, and that would be the UK and its Commonwealth, and their treatment of this practice during the Great War. So let's chow down now on some fish and chips or a nice Sunday roast and maybe take a shot of gin. And now let's talk about the British and its Commonwealth forces. The practice in the UK ranks has come to be known as shot at dawn, and that's when this practice happened in the forces of the United Kingdom, and has led to a considerable inquiry and controversy since the end of the Great War, and it continues to this day. There is a wealth of archival evidence all over the internet and beyond, and if it's something you're interested in, I encourage you to dig deeper. There's also a very moving memorial of the same name in Staffordshire in England. In all, 3,080 death sentences of their own were issued by the British military during the war, and 346 of these were ultimately carried out. The number's a little bit of dispute, but that's probably our most reliable number. Some put it a little lower, some put it a little higher. Almost all of these were specifically pegged to, quote, desertion, while a handful of others were classified as the following: cowardice, quote, quitting a post without authority, quote, disobedience to a lawful command, and casting away arms. Of those cut down by their own team, 25 were Canadians, 22 were Irish, 5 were Kiwis, and 4 hearkened from the British West Indies. Important to mention here that while 119 Australians were sentenced to death for desertion, still under the British Empire, none were ever executed, as its government forbade that for volunteer soldiers. And all of these guys were volunteers, and by the way, the Australians famously lost some of the highest percentages, maybe the highest, per capita during World War I. And we think of Gallipoli most famously for that. Though we've touched on it in passing, let's take a minute to briefly discuss shell shock and what that really was. While it's tempting to compare this sort of extreme trauma to what we now call PTSD, it was loosely defined or diagnosed, and it was all too real and very prevalent within all armies of the First World War. And though it's common now to lambast the British military for executing over 300 of its own men, it's only fair to point out that they seem to have taken this condition more seriously than the other armies. And though it was, again, poorly understood at the time, there were many in both the military and the general public, and definitely in the medical profession, that were sympathetic to the plight of those afflicted. And I can only take a guess here that this had something to do with the fact that the English eventually carried out the sentence of death of just 10% or so of those that had been handed the sentence. But still, though views on this topic may have become more progressive due to all of this brutality, the old guard was surely still in the majority. A man named Lord Gort, a high-ranking officer, testified on the subject to a royal inquiry after the war, stating that though real, shell shock was a weakness and showed, quote, underlying lack of character. No doubt most of his contemporaries in the upper ranks would have concurred. Also, it can't be overstated enough that while no doubt some of these poor souls surely exhibited cowardice by any definition, many would have been shot on very dubious grounds to be made an example of, as was the case in all the battles and all the armies that we're covering. And to that point, let's take a brief peek at a few notorious cases that are as tragic as they are controversial. And a quick note here, I'd like to give a shout out to Kevin Hicks and his outstanding YouTube site called, quote, The History Squad, who does a great job in explaining in more detail some of what we'll discuss in cursory terms in this podcast. And I hope you guys will check that out. The first of these notable executions for desertion we'll mention is a double execution that took place in 1915. And the victims were Joseph Byers and Andrew Evans, both of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. Evans, it appears, was a kind of a hardened veteran who had seen lots of action on the front lines, but Byers was a newbie who, in fact, had received only 2 weeks of training, and get this, he was just 17 years of age. Like countless others, he had faked his years to join, only to end up being executed very soon afterward. The records uncovered posthumously seemed to make it pretty clear that neither man, or boy as it were, actually deserted their post, but rather had failed to show up to some sort of compulsory marching practice. But Byers did admit to desertion. Why? We can't really know, but it's very likely that due to his age and unfamiliarity with military rules and regulations, he neither understood the full charges against him nor the corresponding penalties. He also would have been denied any real defense, even if one had been requested. Remember, this is the front line, and the bullets and the shrapnel were flying, and the gas was burning, and there was really no time or place to hold the tribunal. Well, the both of them were blindfolded and tied to a stake or pole, as was the custom, and they were shot by a firing squad of their own regiment. It appears Evans was killed instantly, but it would take a full 3 volleys to kill poor teenage Joseph Byers. Next is James Crozier from Belfast, whose case is one of the more notorious and one of the most studied, and that is for 2 distinct reasons: his age and his physical state at the time of execution. So if a military execution of a 17-year-old is not tragic enough, now we have a 16-year-old. Keep in mind that the official mandated legal age of enlistment was 18. It appears that this young Ulster lad witnessed incalculable horror almost immediately after being sent into battle. No surprise there. And he had been trapped in some sort of a mine explosion within a few days of being sent to the front, and he was virtually buried alive. But he survived this, and after a very short convalescence, he was returned to service. He was no doubt shell-shocked and reportedly absconded, but after intense research by both professional and amateur historians in all the years since, there seems to be no real evidence to substantiate this. Nevertheless, this 16-year-old boy was convicted and sentenced to be shot. But not before he was plied with so much alcohol that it was noted that he could neither speak nor stand as the moment of reckoning arrived, and so he was carried to the execution pole by fellow soldiers. He was shot by the firing squad, but he did not die from the first round, as we saw with the other young man, and instead was finished off with a shot to the forehead at point-blank range. Well, it doesn't take a military historian or an army veteran, and I'm neither of those, to see that there's a lot wrong with this picture. You have a soldier 2 years below enlistment age, sentenced to death on very specious grounds, with no legal defense, plied with probably lethal amounts of alcohol, and then shot to death by his own men. This seems to break every rule of military protocol imaginable. And while it's never difficult to uncover unspeakable brutality everywhere you look in the First World War, the case of poor James Crozier is particularly notable for its barbarity and sadness. And a final episode we'll mention here is, on the British side, is another double execution that also took place in 1916. And this time it's Albert Ingham and Alfred Longshaw. Al and Al were longtime mates and had enlisted together in the early stages of the war and had seen fierce fighting. So unlike a few of the others we've mentioned, these guys had proven their worth and by all accounts had fought faithfully at the Battle of the Somme, some of the nastiest fighting in human history, and at some point Longshaw gets word that his wife is gravely ill. And so he puts in for leave to try to attend her at home before presumably returning to the front. Well, no surprise, his request is denied and he is ordered back to his duties. Well, I guess he's seen enough, and he refuses, and both he and his buddy Alfred take off and attempt to board a Swedish ship docked in Dieppe in an attempt to sail back home to England. Using aliases and pretending to be Americans, they are found out and returned to their regiment. Now, these guys, whether guilty or not, are very bad escape artists, and I guess their Manchester accents probably didn't pass muster as American accents. Never mind the fact that the United States did not even enter the war until the following year. So the court-martial showed the two no leniency, and they were shot and buried just as they enlisted and absconded together. This took place, again, at dawn on November 28th of 1916. An interesting epilogue here. Though, as was typical of those killed for desertion, the duo's parents were told by official sources that they had been killed in action as to avoid the stigma of the punishment, and presumably to prevent the shaming of the families. But Ingham's father pressed further and was eventually told the truth of his son's death by some of his former comrades, and he successfully petitioned the War Office to have the following inscription added to his son's headstone. And it reads, "Shot at dawn, one of the first to enlist, a worthy son of his father." And for what it's worth, I find that a very noble and moving gesture to a man that died such as he did. We'll wrap up this section on Great Britain and the Commonwealth by mentioning that ever since the end of the war, there have been many attempts by disparate parties within the UK to have those shot at dawn officially cleared of the crimes of which they were punished. This movement gradually gained traction, and dozens were posthumously exonerated during the interwar years, but for decades these attempts were mostly officially rebuffed. It was not until 2006, almost a century after the hostilities, that then British Defense Minister Des Brown announced a general pardon for those executed for desertion. And he said, quote, "I believe it is better to acknowledge that injustices were clearly done in some cases, even if we cannot say which, and to acknowledge that all these men were victims of war. I hope that pardoning these men will finally remove the stigma with which their families have lived for years. So, for our next course, let's grab a big bowl of pasta and a nice scoop of gelato and head to a country that displayed perhaps an unexpectedly unusual penchant for this practice in World War I, and that would be Italia. So let's get to a few numbers, and then we'll try to understand why Italy was so keen on the practice of executing their own soldiers. Italy mobilized a staggering 5.5 million soldiers during the First World War, but that's about 2 million fewer than the French and the Brits, who both built armies of roughly 7.5 to 8 million each. The United States would eventually put almost 4.3 million under arms, despite joining the fray much later in the war and really only being involved for a little over a year. Slightly more than half of the Italian soldiers that served were counted as casualties of one sort or another, and 460,000 were killed in battle. As we've discussed previously, the French suffered roughly 1.4 million killed, and the British Empire about 700,000. But this is not a game that we're playing here. This represents the true carnage of World War I. It's also worth noting here that the Romanian and Serbian armies, both aligned on the Allied side, suffered even more statistically, with an estimated 500,000 killed in action out of a combined 1.5 million mobilized. Hard to read these numbers. And I think we're giving them short shrift there, but the information that I can find in English is scant. But maybe we can do an updated episode on how brutal that was for those countries that helped out on the Allied side. But back to our pasta and gelato before our head keeps spinning from all these morbid numbers. And what stands out here is that the Italian army executed more of its own soldiers than either France or Britain. The number is put at 850, though, as always, that was almost definitely understated. Though it may seem simplistic, there are a few reasons for this, and they have to do with a particular practice in the Italian army and a particular man who served as its chief practitioner. So let's start with the man himself. This would be none other than Luigi Cadorna, the chief of staff of the Italian army, later the Marshal of Italy. In other words, the strong man, the boss. Il Duce. No, not that one. He comes in Act 3. To say this guy was a disciplinarian or a taskmaster would be a massive understatement. By all accounts, he was one nasty son of a bitch, and he was far worse. He was, in my humble view, a mass murderer. Now, if we can extend him any sort of olive branch or maybe some olive oil, his position was extremely difficult as he was commanding millions of men that were composed of any number of feuding factions. As Italy had been, quote, unified only a few generations before, personal and political allegiances were fierce and unwieldy and fragile. Under his command would have been a motley band of Republicans, anarchists, proto-fascists, royalists, etc., not to mention all the sorts of regional rivalries. Has it really changed much today in Italy? I haven't been there for a while, but I don't think it has changed much. Unlike the French and British, whose borders had been established for centuries and whose loyalties and governments were mostly cohesive, Italy as a unified nation was still very much a work in progress at this time. So Cadorna's strategy to keep these wily factions in some semblance of order was to deal with his troops in a particularly ruthless manner. What's particular about Cadorna is that he seems to be as ruthless in his treatment of his officers as he was to his conscripts. He jettisoned hundreds of these men of higher rank, and he ordered the executions of many of them. He held some of these officers under his command guilty and responsible for any considerable mutinies, and he shot them as he did their subordinates. Cadorna, no doubt, referred to the official code that dated from the founding of the new country that stipulated the following. Quote, "Discipline is the spiritual flame of victory. The most disciplined troops, not the best trained, win. The commanding officer has the sacred duty to execute immediately the recalcitrant, and the cowards. Well, this bastard obviously took this to heart, and without hesitation, it seems, summarily ordered the execution of almost 1,000 of his own men. It is said that his reason for doing this went all the way back to the Roman times and the idea of, quote, decimation. And we think of that term loosely today. We think of it to think of total destruction or annihilation of some sort. But that's a contemporary interpretation. And it is what it says, the arbitrary killing of 1 out of every 10 soldiers in a regiment that is proven unworthy or insubordinate during wartime. Obviously, this was a punitive action to keep the forces in the trenches fighting the enemy for fear of being shot by their own. It seems insane to us today, probably, but though the jury is and always will be still out on the question, it seems likely that Cadorna employed this ancient quotient in deciding life or death of the men under his command. Bottom line here is the Italian military killed more of its own than any other Allied forces. We'll talk briefly about the United States because it doesn't really play much of a role to us in our topic here. And think what you want, but the U.S. was basically dragged into a foreign battle on a foreign continent with bitter disagreement as to its own role, if any. There was great dispute domestically as to whether the United States should get involved, but eventually Woodrow Wilson, maybe the worst president in U.S. history, in my opinion, made the call, and off the boys went into battle. Here are the American numbers: about 275,000 casualties, probably 80,000 or so killed, and that would have been about 20,000 or so more than in Vietnam, but in a much, much shorter period. Only just a little bit over a year. It should be noted of over 4 million who served, there were 150 or so that were condemned to death for desertion, but none were actually executed. 24 were killed by their own side, but for capital crimes. The remainder would have been sentenced to hard labor or long prison sentences. So now we'll kick it to the other side of this horror show, and we'll learn what we can about the so-called Central Powers. Just as we've seen on the Allied side, the practice of execution for desertion or cowardice will likely surprise you. So let's get our gas masks on and bandage our trench feet, and let's peer into the trenches of the opposing forces. These would be the so-called Central Powers. Now let's be honest about who started this whole mess, and that's Germany. Okay, go ahead, Franz Ferdinand fans, and pin it on Austria-Hungary, but just get in line for your time in the sun, and trust me, you're next. The German army mobilized 11 million soldiers during the First World War. By the end of the fighting, at least half of these would become casualties in one way or another. About 2 million were killed on the battlefield. However, as to our topic, these Huns that ravaged its neighbors and killed untold millions of totally innocent people and left France and the Low Countries in ruins, they executed, wait for it, wait, somewhere between 18 to 50. 1,000? No, 18 to 50 soldiers, period. It's estimated that probably 150,000 German soldiers did desert, most of them to neighboring countries caught in this quagmire like the Netherlands or Denmark or Switzerland. But if these numbers are anywhere close, it's a far smaller desertion rate than all of the European combatants in the war. As always, the exact numbers are unreliable, but we do know that Germany rarely executed their own during the First World War. But just wait till the next episode, where, when the Führer comes into power, this number would grow by over 1,000%. So there's not much to say really about our topic as it relates to the German forces in World War I. So we'll move next door to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and these guys are the real butchers of their own. This crumbling so-called empire sent 6.5 million to the war, and a staggering 75% or so were casualties in one way or another, and somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5 million were killed in battle. So they lost far more than the British, and almost as many as the French. But they do hold the distinction of killing more of their own than any other force in World War I on either side. And what's interesting here is that while court-martials and execution orders for desertion were sparsely carried out on the Allied side, as we've seen, they were almost always consummated in this army. Fully 98% of death sentences that were handed down were carried out. Of the 1,175 condemned, 1,148 were shot. Compare that to the 0% to roughly 20% amongst the various Allied armies. So in other words, when you were enlisted in this army and you were handed the death sentence, you weren't going to prison, you were going to your grave. As we close out this episode, I'd like to point out that what we've presented here is an admittedly incomplete survey. That's not by design, but it's a reality of the inability to fully and faithfully present accurate information of several of the other combatants, both major and minor. We know that Russia, fighting for the Allied side, for instance, saw roughly 2 million soldiers killed on the Eastern Front during the Great War, but there's really no way of knowing how many of these men were killed by their own. Conversely, we know that the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, fighting for the Central Powers, lost over 300,000 killed, but there's just no data to show us how prevalent capital punishment was within their ranks. The Serbs, the Romanians, the Belgians, Greeks, and smaller countries fighting with the Allies took very significant casualties, but those relating to our topic are just lost to history if they were ever known at all. We do have good reason to know that Bulgaria, who weighed offers from both sides before ultimately aligning itself with the Central Powers, bad move Bulgaria, was reported to have shot 600 of its own men, mostly for trying to bolt to the other side. Shame on you, Bulgaria. Well, we hope you've learned a lot here, and we certainly did, and come join us on episode 3 of the topic, where we fast forward just a generation later to the same landscape, which will make what we've just learned about here look like Disneyland.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.